Hey everybody, today we're talking about the Kreg plywood ripping jig. Now this is not the track saw jig. This is just simply the ripping jig where you put your circular saw in the base plate here, which is super simple to get aligned and get measured right, which is really cool. It has this little block that you adjust on this side here, and it helps you line up to where it needs to be here. And then you use these two tabs and screw down these set screws that hold it in place. And as you can tell, it holds it. I don't have any problem holding it and feeling like it's gonna fall out. It's super secure, and it's really easy to use. Now, a couple things to know about this is that it does have a 24-inch length cut width, so you can't go past 24 inches. And you also have to make up the difference between your saw blade thickness and the guide that it's running on here. So you'll want to always make sure you have a tape measure with you and learn how this measures. Learning how this measures will make it super handy for you to use in the future, and it will help speed things up. I had to just do a couple of measurements up front, figure out how they were using their measurements and where it landed on the blade. But once you do that, then it becomes really simple. You flip this gauge up here. Now you have a indicator here, and that little red line tells you where you're at. You just slide this back and forth to whatever measurement you want. You lock this down, and then you put this on the edge of whatever you're cutting, and you can run a relatively straight line. One downside to this is that if the edge you're following is a soft curve, then you won't get a straight line because you're following that edge, and if it's a soft curve, this will follow that. If there's a sharp dip in it, this will smooth that out because it's long enough that it'll run over that dip. But if it's a soft dip or a soft curve, it will follow it. And last but not least, the other couple things you need to think about is that just because you have this edge here running doesn't mean that it can't twist on you while you're cutting. If you're not following and using this and making sure it's up against whatever material you're running it on, then this could twist on you and you could run offline. So what I tend to do is I actually push sideways on this and push forward on the saw at the same time to make sure that it stays up against that edge that I'm using. And like if you're using plywood or whatever, which is where this comes in the most beneficial for me at least, you're gonna find that the factory edge is pretty straight, and you could just kind of push it up against that and run it down and not have to take big sheets of plywood to the table saw all the time. But this is not a replacement for a track saw setup. So is the Kreg ripping jig worth the money? In my opinion, it absolutely is, because I use it enough in those specific circumstances within the dimensions that it can cut. Once again, it has a 24-inch cut width that you can use this adjustment on. So if you're cutting over that size, a lot of times it's probably not going to be in your interest or in your best use. But if you are cutting lots of smaller pieces off of plywood or whatever, then it can definitely be handy, and it's a lot faster than setting up a track saw or a circular saw guide to cut and rip small pieces of wood. One last thing to know about the Kreg ripping jig is that this jig does add about 1/4 of an inch of thickness under the saw. So you will lose about 1/4 of an inch of cutting depth at its max. So for plywood and most like smaller boards, it's not gonna be a big deal, but if you're trying to rip through something deeper, then you are gonna lose 1/4 of an inch. And if you're trying to rip from both sides, so like cut on top and then flip it over and then cut on the bottom, it could be the difference of you actually making it all the way through and making those two cuts connect or not. So keep that in mind, that you are losing about 1/4 of an inch in thickness of cut depth because of this jig plate right here. A couple last things that I want to mention about this jig for you guys so that you have a better understanding and kind of know a little bit more about it before you buy it, is that it is made of plastic. The plastic is actually pretty solid, but as you can tell, it does flex. And that's partly just because as this gets further away from the saw, everything's going to rotate a little bit more with this aluminum and everything like that. The track does slide relatively easily on the aluminum, but as is common, the plastic and the aluminum do bind. So you just have to kind of work it a little bit. As you can see, it jitters and stuff, and it can be a little bit frustrating at times to get it precisely where you want it. The other thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, if you have a soft curve in your straight edge, then this will follow that soft curve, and that won't be good. Another thing to keep in mind is that if it's a thin sheeted material, like underlayment or something like that, or veneer, this will not be a good guide to run on thin sheets like that. So is the Kreg ripping jig worth it for your circular saw? It can be. I'm not going to say it is for everybody, but it can be. It has been a super helpful jig for me to have around the house for cutting plywood, and there are a few tricks that you can learn to do with this so that it makes it easier to use and it makes it more versatile for you. And we can go about those in the future in another video.